The shift handover was already 40 minutes late when Garrett Cole walked into the service corridor beneath the Vathari Royal Palace and found no one waiting for him. He stood at the junction of Tunnel 3 and Tunnel 7, maintenance satchel over one shoulder, thermos of black coffee in his left hand, and looked down the long corridor in both directions. Empty. The overhead glow strips hummed their usual low drone. Condensation beaded on the pipes that ran along the ceiling like veins. The floor was clean. He had mopped it himself 14 hours ago, and his footsteps echoed in a way they never did when the night crew was present. Garrett checked his watch. 5:40. The night shift should have been here 30 minutes ago to brief him. Yellen, the Vathari second shift supervisor, always met him at this junction with a clipboard of overnight incidents. Had done it every morning for the 11 years Garrett had worked this posting. Nobody was here. He pulled his comm unit from his belt and keyed the maintenance channel. Static. He tried the service frequency. Static. He tried the Palace General Band and got a single tone, the lockout signal that meant non-essential personnel were barred from communication until further notice. Something was wrong. Garrett Cole was 54 years old, built like a man who had spent 3 decades carrying toolboxes up ladders and crawling through access panels not designed for human shoulders. He had gray at his temples and permanent grease stains on his knuckles that no amount of solvent could fully remove. He was the human maintenance chief of the Vathari Royal Palace, a title that sounded grander than it was. In practice, it meant he supervised the 6 human workers assigned to the palace's lower infrastructure. The heating exchangers, the atmospheric processors, the waste cycling systems, the plumbing, and the electrical conduits that the Vathari themselves considered too cramped, too dirty, and too beneath their station to maintain personally. The Vathari were tall, pale-skinned, elegant, 2.5 meters on average, with skin the color of winter moonlight and faintly luminescent markings along their temples and throats that pulsed with emotion. They moved through their palace like living sculpture, draped in flowing fabrics that seemed to pour rather than hang, and they spoke in voices that resonated at frequencies humans felt in their chests. They were beautiful in the way a cathedral is beautiful, designed to make you feel small. And they had designed their entire service structure to make the humans who maintained it feel exactly that way. Garrett set his thermos on a pipe bracket and walked toward the main service hub. His boots sounded loud in the silence. Too loud. There should have been the distant clatter of cleaning drones, the hiss of atmospheric vents cycling, the soft murmur of Vathari housekeeping staff in the corridors above. Nothing. He found the first sign of trouble at the service hub entrance. The electronic lock had been manually overridden, someone had used a staff master key, and the door stood open 6 inches. Inside, the hub was dark except for the amber emergency lighting. Every workstation was powered down. Every locker stood open and empty. The night staff had not just left early, they had cleaned out. Garrett pulled the door fully open and stepped inside. The duty board on the far wall still held the shift assignments he himself had posted 2 days ago. Beneath them, pinned with a single metallic tack, was a sheet of pressed Vathari parchment covered in the elegant flowing script the species used for formal declarations. He could read it. 11 years on the posting had made him fluent, but it took him a moment to process what it said. It was a collective withdrawal of service. Every Vathari servant, maintenance worker, groundskeeper, and domestic laborer assigned to the palace had walked off shift simultaneously at midnight. The declaration cited the covenant of dignified labor, an ancient Vathari legal framework that allowed collective refusal of service when a household head violated specific conditions of treatment. The conditions listed covered 3 pages. Garrett read them carefully. Underpayment, unsafe quarters, verbal degradation, denial of rest cycles, confiscation of personal effects during service hours, 14 separate violations, each one documented with dates and witnesses. He knew, without reading further, who had driven them to this. Seneschal Draven, the palace's chief administrator. A tall, angular Vathari male with pale silver skin and marks that never pulsed, a sign, Garrett had learned, of carefully controlled emotion. Draven ran the palace staff the way a man might run a prison, through silence, through small denials, through the removal of comfort in increments so slight that no single act seemed worth reporting but the cumulative weight crushed. Garrett had watched it for years, had watched the Vathari servants move through the corridors with their eyes down, had watched them flinch when Draven's footsteps sounded, had seen the youngest among them, barely adults by Vathari standards, working double shifts with no meal breaks because Draven declared their efficiency insufficient and assigned remedial hours. He had filed reports about it. 3 of them through the human labor liaison. None had been acknowledged. That was the way of things in the Vathari royal palace. The humans maintained the infrastructure below. The Vathari maintained the appearance above. And the queen, Empress Solen, technically, though the household staff called her the queen because she hated the formality of her full title, lived in the upper levels and presumably believed her home ran smoothly because everyone in it was content. Garrett folded the declaration, put it in his breast pocket and walked back to the junction. He had a decision to make. His 6 human workers answered to him. They were not part of the Vathari labor covenant. Humans operated under a separate interspecies service contract, and the walkout did not technically include them. His people maintained the systems below. They were not obligated to cover the work above, and the work above was considerable. Meal preparation, chamber cleaning, atmospheric management of the living quarters, ceremonial preparation, the queen's personal attendance, her wardrobe, her schedule, her morning tea. The palace above was about to wake up, and when it did, there would be no one there. No one except Garrett Cole and his crew of 6. He keyed his personal comm, the one that ran on human encryption, not the palace network, and called Chen, his second. She answered on the first tone. "Already heard," she said. Her voice was calm in the way people are calm when they have been awake worrying for 2 hours. "Yuki called me at 400. Said the Vathari service staff came through the human quarters at midnight collecting their people. Quiet, organized. Nobody tried to recruit us, but they made sure we knew." "Where are our people?" Garrett asked. "Waiting in the auxiliary, all 6. We figured you'd have orders." "I don't have orders. I have a thermos in an empty corridor." Chen was quiet for a moment. "Draven is going to come down here the moment he realizes." "I know. He's going to tell us to cover the upper levels." "I know that too." "Are we going to?" Garrett looked down the empty tunnel. Condensation dripped from a pipe joint. He could hear the distant hum of the atmospheric processor, the one he had repaired last week with a hand-brazed patch because the requisition for replacement parts had been denied. Again. "Get everyone to the auxiliary," he said. "I'll be there in 10. He did not go to the auxiliary first. He went up. The service lifts still worked. They ran on an independent power circuit that his team maintained, and Garrett rode one to the 3rd sublevel, then walked the maintenance stairwell to the palace proper. He emerged through a service door into the main gallery, a soaring corridor of pale blue crystal walls and floors so polished they reflected the overhead light like still water. The gallery was empty and silent. Morning light poured through arched windows 3 stories tall, and dust motes drifted through the beams like flecks of gold. It was beautiful. It was always beautiful, and in 11 years Garrett had never once walked through it during active hours. He had always moved through the service passages, unseen, the way Draven preferred. He walked the gallery now. His work boots scarred, resoled twice. The left one, slightly darker from a pipe leak 3 years ago, left no prints on the crystal floor, but the sound of each step was a small declaration. He was here. He was visible, and the gallery did not collapse because a maintenance worker had walked through it. At the far end, he found what he was looking for. Queen's Morning Terrace, the open-air platform where Empress Solène took her first meal of the day. The table was set. Someone from the night shift had laid it before they left. A single-place setting of hammered silver, a folded napkin, an empty teacup. They had set the table and then walked away, and the gesture struck Garrett as unbearably dignified. They had finished their last task. They had not sabotaged. They had not stolen. They had simply done the final thing correctly, and then they had gone. He stood looking at the table for a long moment, then turned and went back down to his people. The auxiliary was a square room with concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and a table built from shipping crates that Garrett had bolted together 9 years ago. His team was there: Chen, Yuki, Marcos, Delphine, Osai, and young Talbot. 6 humans in work coveralls, sitting on folding chairs, drinking from their own thermoses, watching him as he walked in. "Here's where we are," Garrett said. He laid it out simply. The Vathari service staff had walked. The palace above was unmanned. Draven would come looking for someone to fill the gap within the hour. Legally, the humans were not obligated to cover Vathari domestic work. Their contracts specified infrastructure maintenance only. But Draven would not care about legal distinctions, and the Queen, whoever she was behind the ceremony, would wake up to a cold and empty home. "What do we do?" Talbot asked. He was 23. This was his first off-world posting. Garrett looked at his crew. 6 people. 6 humans who had spent years being invisible in this palace, who moved through service tunnels so the Vathari would not have to see them working, who ate their meals in this concrete box because the staff dining hall had a sign on the door, not a rule, just a sign that said infrastructure personnel, lower canteen only, who had never once been invited to a palace function, a holiday observance, or a shift-end gathering. "We do our job," Garrett said. "Our actual job, the pipes, the processors, the heating, the electricals. We keep the bones running. That's what we're contracted for, and that's what we do." "And the upstairs?" Chen asked. "Not our contract, not our concern." Marcos leaned back in his chair. "Draven won't see it that way. Draven can read the contract." A silence settled. Then Osai, quiet, careful Osai, who had been on this posting longer than anyone except Garrett, spoke. "The Queen. She'll have no one, not just Draven, the Queen herself." Garrett was quiet for a moment. He had seen Empress Solène exactly 4 times in 11 years, each time from a distance, once from a sub-level grate when she walked overhead, twice from a service corridor window, and once face-to-face when she had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a maintenance stairwell. She had looked at him the way one looks at an unexpected piece of furniture, polite confusion, a gentle "pardon me." Then she was gone, and Garrett had gone back to fixing a drain. "I'll handle the Queen," he said. The first confrontation came at 700 sharp. Draven appeared at the entrance to the human maintenance section like a silver blade, tall, angular, immaculate in his seneschal's formal wrap, with those flat, unpulsing marks along his temples and a clipboard held like a weapon. "Maintenance Chief Cole." His voice carried the precise diction of someone who had rehearsed exactly what they would say. "I require your team on the upper levels, full domestic coverage until replacement staff is arranged." Garrett was at his workbench, replacing a corroded fitting on a pressure valve. He did not stand. He did not turn. He finished threading the new fitting, tested the seal with his thumb, and set the valve on the bench before looking up. "Morning Seneschal." "That's not in our contract." Draven's marks did not pulse. His jaw tightened by a fraction. "I am invoking emergency service authority. The palace is in crisis." "The palace infrastructure is running fine. I checked it at 5:30. Whatever's happening above is a domestic staffing issue, and our contract is infrastructure only. Section 7, Clause 3. You would leave the Empress without service. I'm keeping her heating, her water, her air, and her electrical systems running. That's my job. The rest is yours." Draven stared at him. The silence stretched. Then the seneschal turned and walked away without another word. Garrett picked up the next valve and started threading. By 900, The palace above was in quiet chaos. Garrett knew this not because he went up, he stayed below with his crew, but because the calm chatter on the palace administrative frequency, which he could monitor if not participate in, told the whole story. Draven was calling external agencies, private domestic services, temporary labor contractors. Everyone he called either could not staff a royal palace on 4 hours' notice or would not, because the covenant of dignified labor was a legally recognized action, and any contractor who broke it faced industry blacklisting. The Queen's morning tea went unserved, her chambers went uncleaned. The atmospheric system in the living quarters, which required manual calibration every morning by trained attendants who understood the Queen's respiratory preferences, drifted toward a generic default setting that was technically safe but noticeably different. At 10:30, Garrett did something he had never done in 11 years of service. He made tea. Not for himself. He made it the way he had seen the Vathari attendants make it, during the years he spent maintaining the kitchen's heating elements and water lines. He had watched them from beneath floor grates and through service hatches, watched the precise way they warmed the pot, the temperature they heated the water to not boiling, 87 degrees exactly, because the Vathari aromatic leaves released bitterness above 90, the single clockwise pour, the 2-minute steep. He had watched because Garrett Cole watched things. It was what maintenance people did. You watched systems until you understood them, and then you kept them running. He carried the tea up the service lift to the 3rd sublevel, walked the maintenance stairwell to the palace proper, and stepped through the service door into the corridor outside the Queen's study. Empress Solène was sitting on the floor. Not on the polished crystal floor of the gallery, on the carpet in the alcove outside her study door, legs folded beneath her in a posture that looked undignified for a woman of her stature. Her skin was pale ivory with a soft blue undertone, and the luminescent marks along her throat pulsed a slow, uncertain amber. She was staring at the locked door of her study as if it had personally betrayed her. Garrett stopped walking. He was holding a tray, one of the utilitarian metal trays from the maintenance kitchen, not the hammered silver the attendants used, with a teapot, a single cup, and a small dish of the pressed honey cakes he had found in the emergency stores. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were large, pale violet, slightly wider than human proportions. The marks along her temples shifted from amber to a startled blue. She did not recognize him. That much was clear. She saw the coveralls, the grease stains, the maintenance badge on his chest, the tray in his hands, and she could not assemble these elements into something that made sense. "I brought tea," Garrett said. "It might not be perfect. I learned from watching, not from training." She blinked at him. "You are maintenance." "Yes, ma'am, Garrett Cole, maintenance chief. I look after the systems below." Below, she said it as if the word were foreign, as if the concept that her palace had a below and that someone lived in it had never fully registered. "The pipes, the heating, the air systems, the electrical," he paused. "Your water is still running. Your air is still cycling. The heating is still on. That's my team." She looked at the tray and the tea. "That's not my team, that's just me." He set the tray on the floor beside her because she was on the floor, and it seemed wrong to stand over her holding it and straightened. "The honey cakes are from emergency stores. They're 3 months old, but they're sealed. Should be fine." Empress Solène looked at the tray on the floor beside her. Then she looked up at him again, and this time her marks shifted to something Garrett had never seen before, a soft, deep violet that pulsed once and held. He did not know what it meant. "Everyone left," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Draven says they broke their contract." "They didn't. They invoked the covenant. Legally protected." Her marks flickered. "You know the covenant." "I've been here 11 years, ma'am. I know most of the labor law. Had to protect my own people." She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the teacup, poured carefully from the pot, the correct single clockwise pour, Garrett noticed, which meant the attendants had learned it from her, not the other way around, and took a sip. Her eyes closed briefly. "It is not perfect," she said. "The temperature is 2 degrees too cool. The steep was perhaps 30 seconds too long. I apologize." "Do not. It is the kindest thing anyone has done for me today." She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. "Garrett Cole, maintenance chief, what is happening in my home?" He told her. Not everything. Not his opinions or his judgments. He told her the facts the way a maintenance chief tells you about a system failure, clearly, precisely, without embellishment. He told her the Vathari service staff had walked off at midnight under the covenant of dignified labor. He told her the declaration cited 14 violations. He told her the violations were attributed to the office of the seneschal. He told her his own team was not part of the walkout and was continuing infrastructure maintenance per their contract. He told her Draven had attempted to compel his team to cover domestic duties, and he had refused. She listened without interrupting. Her tea grew cold in her hands. 14 violations, she said when he finished. Yes, ma'am. You said attributed to the seneschal's office. Not to me. The covenant distinguishes between a household head and their appointed administrator. The staff's grievance is with Draven's management, not with you personally. Something shifted in her expression. The marks along her throat pulsed deep blue, and Garrett had been here long enough to know that deep blue, in Vathari body language, meant something close to shame. I did not know, she said softly. Garrett was quiet. He could have said something kind. He could have said it wasn't her fault, that administrators shielded their principals, that no one expected her to know everything happening in her own household. All of those things were true, and none of them would help. Instead, he said, the staff did their job well. Every day I've been here, they did their job well. They set your table last night before they left. Full place setting, folded napkin, then they walked. Her marks went almost white. She set the teacup down on the tray with exaggerated care, as if she might break something if she moved too quickly. Thank you, Garrett Cole, she said. He nodded once and turned to go. One moment, her voice stopped him. Your contract, it says infrastructure only. Yes, ma'am. Then why the tea? Garrett stood in the corridor, his back half turned, and considered the question. 11 years. 11 years of crawling through spaces too small for the people who built them. 11 years of being the thing that scuttled in the walls. 11 years of the lower canteen only sign and the startled look when he accidentally surfaced during active hours. Because you were sitting on the floor, he said, and nobody was coming. He left her there and went back down to his systems. The rest of the day unfolded in a quiet war. Draven, unable to find replacement staff, attempted 3 more times to commandeer the human maintenance team. Garrett refused each time with the same flat calm. The second time, Draven threatened contract termination. Garrett pulled the actual contract from his files and read Section 7, Clause 3 aloud. The third time, Draven stood in the maintenance corridor for 11 minutes without speaking, his marks perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Garrett's back as Garrett continued replacing gaskets on a water line. Then Draven left and did not come back. At 1400, Garrett went up again. He brought lunch, not Vathari cuisine, which he did not know how to prepare, but a human meal. Sandwiches on dense bread, cut into quarters, with a side of the pickled vegetables that Chen grew in hydroponic trays in the maintenance section. He found the queen in her study this time. Someone had unlocked it, possibly herself, sitting at her desk surrounded by data pads, reading what appeared to be labor law. He set the tray on her desk without ceremony. It's human food, plain but filling. She looked at the sandwich quarters, then at him. You are still the only one who has come. I noticed. Draven told me the walkout was illegal, that the staff were in breach. He's wrong, I told you that this morning. Yes. I have now read the covenant myself. She picked up a sandwich quarter and examined it. For 11 years this palace has had a maintenance chief who reads Vathari labor law, knows the correct temperature for aromatic tea, and makes his own food by hand. And I did not know his name until today. Garrett did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. That is the violation, she said. Not the 14 on the declaration, the real one, that everyone in this building was invisible to me. She took a bite of the sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, swallowed. This is unexpectedly good. Chen's pickles, she'd be pleased to hear it. Over the next 6 hours, Garrett did something extraordinary by doing nothing extraordinary at all. He ran his shift. He maintained the systems. He kept the bones of the palace alive, the water flowing, the air cycling, the heating consistent, the electrical stable. And 3 times more he went up. Each time he brought something small. A fresh pot of tea at 1600. A report at 1800. Not his report, but the collected maintenance logs from the past year, which included every staffing concern his team had documented, every denied requisition, every incident where Draven had redirected resources from infrastructure to cosmetic improvements in the public areas. He did not editorialize. He simply handed her the data the way he handed her the tea, plainly, on the utilitarian tray, without ceremony. At 2000, the palace's atmospheric system triggered a warning. Not a failure, a calibration drift in the Queen's private quarters. The system had been running on generic defaults all day without the manual adjustment her attendants normally performed. The air was still breathable, still safe, but it was wrong. Too dry for Vathari respiratory needs at rest. Another hour and it would reach the threshold where her mucous membranes began to irritate. Garrett knew the system. His team maintained the hardware. But the software calibration, the specific atmospheric recipe for each room, was normally handled by the domestic staff. He climbed up one more time. The Queen was in her private sitting room, a data pad in her lap, her marks pulsing a focused blue-white that meant she was deep in thought. She looked up when the service door opened. The air system needs manual calibration, Garrett said. Your attendants usually handle it, but they're gone and the drift is reaching the yellow. I need to know your respiratory preferences, temperature, humidity, oxygen percentage, and whether you want the aromatic diffuser active. She stared at him. Then she almost smiled, not quite, but the shape of it lived in the way her marks pulsed briefly warm. You are asking me what air I breathe. Yes, ma'am, so I can set it correctly. 22 degrees, 78% humidity, standard Vathari oxygen mix, and yes, the diffuser, blue sage if there is any remaining in the reservoir. Garrett pulled a worn notebook from his breast pocket and wrote it down. The same notebook where he logged pipe pressures and valve conditions and electrical faults. The Queen's preferred air went on the same page as last week's water main reading. I'll have it set in 20 minutes. Garrett. He paused at the service door. You have done more today than keep the systems running. I kept one additional system running, ma'am, that's all. Her marks pulsed that deep violet again. What system? He thought about it. About the Vathari servants who had walked with such careful dignity. About the table set perfectly before they left. About 14 violations documented with dates and witnesses. About a woman sitting on the floor of her own palace because no one had told her that her home was breaking the people who served it. Yours, he said, and went back down to calibrate the air. By 2200, the palace was quiet in the way buildings are quiet when they are running on skeleton staff and determination. Garrett's team had worked a double shift without complaint. The infrastructure held. Not a single system had faltered. The pipes ran. The air cycled. The water flowed. Everything below the surface continued exactly as it had for 11 years, invisible, reliable, maintained by people the building was designed to forget. At 22:30, Garrett was in the maintenance hub replacing a circuit board in the environmental monitoring panel when his comm chimed. Not the palace network, his personal unit. Cole. It was an unfamiliar voice. Female Vathari with the resonant harmonic quality they all carried. Maintenance Chief Cole, this is Seneschal Draven's office. You are requested in the Great Hall immediately. He finished seating the circuit board, closed the panel, and wiped his hands on his coveralls. Then he rode the lift up. The Great Hall was a cathedral-sized space of pale blue crystal and white marble, lit by overhead panels that simulated perpetual soft daylight. Garrett had been inside it exactly once, during his initial orientation 11 years ago, when a board administrative assistant had walked the new human laborers through the palace's public areas at speed, pointing out which corridors they were permitted to use, service only, and which they were not all of these. Tonight the Great Hall was occupied. Empress Solène stood at the center, still in the clothes she had worn all day, no attendants to help her change, with a data pad in one hand and a stillness that made the vast room feel small around her. Draven stood to her left, his marks carefully flat, his posture rigid. And to the Queen's right, partially visible through the great arched entrance, stood a delegation. Vathari, 15-20 of them. Garrett recognized faces: the overnight cleaning supervisor, the kitchen manager, 2 of the younger attendants. They stood in a loose cluster, still in their civilian clothes, watching. The walkout staff, they had come back not to work, to witness. Maintenance Chief Cole, Empress Solène's voice filled the hall without effort. Approach. Garrett walked across the polished floor. His boots sounded like small protests against the silence. He stopped at what seemed like a reasonable distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the deference the situation seemed to require. I have spent today reading, the Queen said. Maintenance logs, staffing reports, requisition denials, labor grievance filings, 3 of which bear your name. I have read the Covenant Declaration and verified every one of its 14 cited violations. I have read your infrastructure contract and confirmed that nothing you did today or refused to do was outside its terms. Garrett stood still, said nothing. Seneschal Draven has been relieved of his position, effective immediately. To his left, Draven did not move. His marks did not pulse. He stood like a silver pillar being slowly dismantled from within. The staff have been offered full restoration under revised terms that comply with the covenant in every particular. They have agreed to return tomorrow under those terms. She glanced toward the delegation at the entrance. Several of them inclined their heads. And you, she looked at Garrett, you maintained this palace today, not only the infrastructure, you maintained its dignity. You treated me as a person who deserved the truth, and you delivered it without resentment, without leverage, without asking for anything in return. That is not in any contract. Garrett felt the weight of the great hall pressing down on him. The crystal walls, the high ceiling, the watching delegation, the silence that demanded something from him. I have a proposal, the Queen continued. A new position, Chief of Household Operations, human and Vathari staff unified under one authority. Your authority, full access to the palace, full voice in staffing decisions, quarters on the upper level. The title carries court rank. The delegation murmured. Draven's jaw tightened fractionally. The Queen's marks pulsed that deep violet Garrett had seen 3 times today. He stood in the great hall of the Vathari royal palace, his work boots on the crystal floor, his coveralls stained with the honest evidence of a double shift, his hands still carrying the faint smell of pipe sealant and machine oil. And he thought about the lower canteen-only sign, about the service corridors designed so no one would have to see him, about 11 years of being the thing in the walls. Ma'am, he said, I appreciate that truly, but I'm going to decline. The silence changed texture. The delegation went still. Even Draven looked at him, a flicker of surprise in those carefully controlled features. "I'm a maintenance chief," Garrett said. "That's what I'm good at, running pipes, fixing systems, keeping the bones alive. I don't want a court rank. I don't want upper quarters. And I don't want to manage the people who just fought for their own dignity. They earned the right to manage themselves." Empress Solène studied him. Her mark cycled through 3 colors in 2 seconds: surprise, consideration, something warm that had no name Garrett knew. "What do you want?" she asked. Garrett thought about it. Really thought. About Chen and Yuki and Marcos and Delphine and Osai and young Talbot. About the concrete auxiliary with the crate table. About the fluorescent lighting and the lower canteen only sign and the requisitions denied year after year. "I want my requisitions approved," he said. "The ones I've been filing for 3 years. New seals for the main water line. Replacement boards for the environmental processors. Proper tools instead of the cast-offs. And I want the sign taken down." "What sign?" "The one on the staff dining hall door. Lower canteen only. It's been there since before I arrived. My people eat in a concrete room because of it." The Queen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The sign will be removed tonight. The requisitions will be approved tomorrow. Is there anything else?" Garrett looked at her. A woman who had spent a day on the floor of her own palace learning that she had been blind, who had read every maintenance log, who had fired the man responsible within 14 hours of learning the truth, who stood now in her great hall in day-old clothes, offering him everything, and accepting without insult that he did not want it. "One more thing," he said. "My people. All 6 of them. I want it in writing that they're permitted in every corridor of this palace during active hours. No more service tunnels unless the job requires it. They live here. They should be able to walk here." "Done," the Queen said. "Anything else?" "No, ma'am, that's enough." He nodded once, not a bow, just a nod, the way a man acknowledges someone he respects, and turned to walk back across the great hall. His boots made that same sound on the crystal floor. Behind him, he could feel the delegation watching, could feel the Queen's gaze on his back, could feel the shape of what had just happened settling into the walls of the palace like mortar setting between stones. At the service door, he paused and looked back. The Queen was still watching. The delegation was still watching. Even Draven, dismissed, diminished, was watching. And for the first time in 11 years, Garrett Cole understood what it meant to be visible. Not because he had asked for it, not because he had demanded it, but because he had stayed when everyone else had left, and he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had kept the systems running, all of them. He gave a small half-wave, barely a gesture, more a flick of the hand, and stepped through the service door. The corridor below was still lit by the same glow strips. The same condensation beaded on the same pipes. His thermos was still sitting on the pipe bracket where he had left it 14 hours ago. He picked it up, shook it, found it empty, and walked back to the auxiliary where his crew was waiting. Chen looked up when he entered. "Well." "Sign's coming down," Garrett said. "Which sign?" "The one on the dining hall. And our requisitions got approved." Marco sat forward. "All of them." "All of them." Talbot stared. "What did you do up there?" Garrett pulled his chair out, sat down heavily, and set his empty thermos on the crate table. His back ached. His knees ached. His hands smelled like pipe sealant and machine oil and the faint ghost of blue sage from calibrating the Queen's air. "Made tea," he said. "Fixed the atmosphere, told the truth." He looked at his crew, 6 humans in work coveralls, 11 years invisible in a palace that was learning to see. "Same thing we do every day, just upstairs for once." Chen smiled. Yuki poured him coffee from her thermos, the good stuff, the dark roast from the supply drops they pooled money for. Garrett wrapped both hands around the cup, felt the warmth seep into his pipe sealant-stained knuckles, and drank. Outside in the service corridor, the glow strips hummed their steady, low drone. The pipes carried water to every level. The air cycled clean and correct. And tomorrow, for the first time in 11 years, 6 humans would walk the corridors of the Vathari royal palace in daylight, through the front passages, past the crystal walls and the polished floors visible. Not because anyone had given them permission to be remarkable, because someone had finally given them permission to be present. And that in the end was enough.